All right, so let's go over the remainder of these. So a conditional, again, I'm going to focus on just using P's and Q's for right now, so I'm not writing some lengthy statement out for this general scenario. So a conditional statement goes if P, then Q. So P and Q are going to be actual statements. The converse, what the converse does to the conditional is it flips it. So if the conditional is if P, then Q, the converse is if Q, then P. So they flip locations. All right, the inverse relates to the conditional, and what it's going to do is it's going to do something called negating. So you're going to see this symbol, and that symbol means not, and that's another word of negating. So if the conditional was if P, then Q, the inverse is going to be if not P, then not Q. And the contrapositive relates to the converse, and it's going to do the exact same thing. So if the converse is if Q, then P, then the contrapositive is if not Q, then not P. Okay, so now let me show you with actual words. But again, all you're doing is you're replacing the P and the Q with other words, which we're going to see right now. So it says write the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive. So you were given the conditional statement, and then you're going to determine the truth value for each of these statements. So the conditional statement, or here we go. So it says two angles that have the same measure are congruent. So what we did on the front page, we're going to do now. We're going to write ourselves an if-then statement. That if-then statement is going to be our conditional. So we have to figure out the hypothesis, and we have to figure out the conclusion. So our conditional, again, this is your P, this is your Q. If two angles have the same measure, so if two angles have the same measure, comma, then they are, and I'm going to use the congruent symbol to save some writing here. So if two angles have the same measure, then they're congruent. Well, by definition, if they have the same measure, they're congruent. That makes sense. That's true. Now, the converse flips those two statements. So if the conditional was if two angles have the same measure, then they're congruent. The converse would be if two angles not have the same measure now, if two angles are congruent, then they have the same measure. And they have the same measure. Okay, so if two angles are congruent, then they have the same measure. Again, that makes sense. That's a true statement, so we circle true. Now, the inverse, remember, relates to the conditional and it negates it. So if the conditional was if two angles have the same measure, then they're congruent. We've got to negate both parts. So we're going to rewrite it, but we're going to add an extra word in there. So if two angles, instead of have, we're going to write do not have the same measure. Okay, then they, and instead of writing are congruent, we're going to write are not congruent. And those are your two negating words. Again, you have to add something in there that's going to say no, not going to happen for both parts. So it says if two angles, if they do not have the same measure, then they are not congruent. Well, again, that's another true statement. Now the contrapositive relates to the converse and it does something very similar. Or you can flip the inverse basically. So if two angles are not congruent, then they do not have the same measure. Then they do not have the same measure. Okay. So again, if it helps you to label the parts here, this is your P, this is your Q. The converse flips it, so here's Q and P. For an inverse, we have not P,